Thank you. Thank you all for coming and staying. It's been terrific. We'll have a chance to say appropriate thanks before too long. I'm now going to introduce our last speaker, another dear friend in my life, Howard Hull. I first went to Brantwood probably in 1992 or 1993, having fallen under Mr. Ruskin's spell, and I got there in the late afternoon and visited the house next day, and I don't know, it's sort of like a Mecca to me, and just gorgeous, but quiet, pristine, traditional. And then, a few years later, Howard and Pamela Hull came to take over Brentwood, and they began a transformation that has turned it into really one of the great, great institutions, in the best use of that word, in England, and of course in the Ruskin world. It now thrives. It is a delight to go there. Yesterday we heard a wonderful talk from Sandra Kemp about her vision for the Ruskin in Lancaster and how she intends to move it into the modern world in a very vigorous way. Well, a great model for that is what has been done at Brantwood, as she well knows. So I introduce Howard Hull, who is Brantwood's director and has been since that time in 1996. He lives there with his very dear and wonderful wife, Pamela. And they, over the course of the time since they have been there, they have completely refurbished, revivified, replanted, redesigned in some ways the entire 250 acres of the Brantwood estate, all at the same time preserving the most important elements of Ruskin's life and time there, often using, as Howard may tell you, Ruskin's own designs for Brentwood as their guide in their doing of this. They have hosted over 200 exhibitions during the time that they have been there. The last one last year, which we were privileged to see with a group of American folks who went over to see Ruskin's England together on Turner's Venice, when we had wonderful Turner watercolors in Brentwood. Nothing would have delighted Ruskin more than having Turner watercolors back at Brentwood. So Howard is the director of the Guild of St. George. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and Fellows. Is that right? Fellows. And a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society. He is a modern man of many tastes and talents, and he is our last speaker, and you will delight in what he has to tell you.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that extremely kind and generous introduction. Thank you sincerely and deeply to Steve Hindle and the Huntington for this wonderful gathering. It's been inspirational. It's been a privilege for us to be here and to discover your world, to discover the Huntington, which is an astonishing institution. And of course, because I love both buildings and gardens and land, it's wonderful to see the spectacular mix of those two things here at the Huntington. But you've looked after us absolutely, phenomenally, and with great kindness and warmth, and I really appreciate that. My special thanks to Jim. Jim is an old friend, but even if he wasn't an old friend, I'd be thanking him from the bottom of my heart for this event, because, to have the vision for it and to pull it off and to bring Ruskin so many thousand miles across the ocean and airwaves has really just been an important thing in an important year. Yes, I live at Brantwood. I'm not going to talk a great deal about Brantwood today because my theme is where Ruskin stands now and where he, in a sense, projects into the future. But a note about Brantwood. Pamela and I have the good fortune to actually live at Brantwood in the house. And when we moved into Brantwood, one of the things that I had to do was to go to the court and get a drinks license. That's not so that I could have a drink, but so that I could sell drinks to the public, make some money for Brantwood. So in those days, you had to go and present yourself in front of magistrates who would judge whether or not you were a suitable person. And also, you had to take the plans of the building, and they judged whether or not the building was suitable for the purpose as well. It took us some time to find any plans of the building, to be honest. And they were all rolled up, and I didn't really open them until I'd taken them to the court. And we rolled them out on the sort of on the bench, and the magistrates all came down and stood around and looked at these things. And one of them suddenly looked rather sort of ill. And he looked up at me and he said, "What, Mr. Hull, is the death room?" And I'll tell you now that actually the death room is where Pamela and I sleep. But it was, in fact, the room in which Ruskin died. It's a very sweet little room, no bad ghosts there. But we do tend to live, eat, and breathe quite a lot of Ruskin. We every now and then I need to get away and try and find a Ruskin-free zone. But it's becoming increasingly difficult. We were in Kentucky one time, stopped at a Cracker Barrel. What was on the shelf? A box of Ruskin cigars, would you believe? He crops up everywhere. And, of course, the bicentenary is not helping my cause because he increasingly appears to be following me around wherever I go. Anyway, it's all to the good, because actually what it means is that Ruskin's in pretty good shape, in a way. I gave a talk, actually, just a week ago at a place called Ruskin Mill, which looks after children who are in a bad way in terms of their education, in terms of their social, their fit in society. It's a very specialist organization, but it's a tremendous organization. It's wonderful work in a series of 6 or 7 colleges around the British Isles, and some abroad now. But they named themselves after Ruskin, and they've always wanted to know a bit more about Ruskin. They invited me to go and speak to them. So I did a talk, actually, entitled Healing Ruskin. And the idea behind the talk was simply that when Ruskin himself suffered greatly from mental illness, as you know, and he needed healing. And he knew that, for instance, nature was a force for him that was a healing force. And a lot of his writing is really interesting. You saw that wealth and ilth balance there in those 2 words. Ruskin knew himself not to be well, but he also knew the world around him, in a sense, not to be well. And he knew in a funny sort of way that he couldn't be well unless the world was well. That these 2 things were sort of inextricably linked in some way or other. Well, we're in an odd position now, because actually Ruskin seems to me to be doing quite well now. He's coming back into health. But I'm not sure the world is just yet. There's got a bit of catching up to do. And so it's the sort of future of Ruskin that he's got to contribute, he's going to contribute to the well-being of the world. And the question is how, really. So I'm going to sort of do a bit of resume. Speaking last at a conference for 2 days on Ruskin means that your speech could get very short. If I was to cross out everything that's been said that I've got down here. So instead I'm going to treat it as a sort of summary. So you'll have to just excuse the fact that, yet again, there will be a few repetitions. But I hope that I will sort of interpret some of the things a little bit differently, or pick up on some of them and explore them. We've heard about, Jim indeed introduced Sesame and Lilies, King's Treasuries, in which Ruskin talks of the pleasure and privilege of being able to sit down with a book and in that moment be one-to-one with a great thinker or poet or storyteller. Our utterances, he indicates, can defy time and space, travelling to places we have never visited, speaking to people we have never met. So we might ask ourselves, well, how is that possible? And the technical answer, of course, is simply the miracle of language in all its myriad forms. It can be a painting, it can be a dance, it could be music, as well as words. But language is based on something else, which in a way is so obvious that we never think about it. We take it for granted. And it's something we all share, and that is consciousness itself. And this is simply not sentience that I'm talking about. Our consciousness, human consciousness, has imaginative power. It projects itself into the world around us. Rather like a bat projects its sonar radar and listens for a return, we're not passive communicators, but imaginative ones. Our imagination, it's an imagination that is, as Ruskin described it, brooding and dream-gifted. Our consciousness stalks the world, actively probing experience. Now, whether we believe experience to be something other, ultimately something spiritual, or to be the mundane handling mechanism of an accidental arrangement of atoms, it doesn't matter as much as we might think, because consciousness itself is a form of potential empathy, ready to connect us to things and them to us. And this applies in equal measure to animate or inanimate things as much as it does to people. Consciousness is a web of imaginative and sometimes unimaginable connection. This is just one of those stones that Ruskin collected. Brantwood was privileged this year to acquire Ruskin's personal collection of minerals, over 2,000 specimens. I can tell you, if you pick any one of these up, it's like entering a universe in itself. And Ruskin talks about how he would sit down with these collections long after he lost the gift of writing and look into these stones and think about them. Language sits on the top of consciousness as an innate attribute that communicates this shared experience of the world, one which is energized or charged by our own desire to connect with it. As Jeremy Nadler points out in The Shadow of the Machine, mankind has existed for by far the larger part of its history in an animistic relationship with the world, where everything has had, in some sense, a spiritual personality. And thus rocks and trees, mountains and rivers could not only be addressed, but could speak back. When Ruskin set out his lecture on the relations of art and science to define the principles which should govern the procedures for scientific investigation, he produced a hierarchy which is in the inverse of how we think of it today. We have first to collect and examine, he said, the traditions respecting the thing, so that we may know what the effect of its existence has hitherto been on the minds of men, and may have at our command what data exists to help us in our inquiries about it, or to guide us in our own thoughts of it. We have, secondly, to examine and describe the thing or creature in its actual state, with utmost attainable veracity of observation. Lastly, we have to examine under what laws of chemistry and physics the matter of which the thing is made has been collected or constructed. Thus we have first to know the poetry of it, i.e. what it has been to man, or what man has made of it. Secondly, the actual facts of its existence. Thirdly, the physical causes of these facts, if we can discover them. You see, top of the list, he placed the myths and folk tales associated with the thing. Our words, our language, acts as a storehouse of our collective knowledge and experience throughout the history of our relationship to a particular thing. Only when we've put ourselves in this wider framework, Ruskin argued, could we go on to look unflinchingly at the evidence before us. Now, Kateri showed us the wonderful painting by Ruskin of the kingfisher. And this beautiful intensity of direct observation reveals a relationship between the artist and the thing in terms of its affection, its intensity of knowing and of its empathy. But actually, it's even more than that. When Ruskin painted the kingfisher, he painted the kingfisher and chose the kingfisher because the kingfisher was known in Greek times as the halcyon. And he goes in a lecture to tell us that the kingfisher was believed by the Greeks to lay its young at sea, on a nest that it built on the sea in the 2 weeks of the winter solstice, which was the only time that the sea was calm enough for it to build its nest on the water. So it would depart out, and 7 days into its journey, it would lay its eggs, and they would then hatch, and the little kingfishers would fledge, and 7 days later, they would come back. So he pitches this kingfisher as a symbol of, it's known as the halcyon days. That's why we have the phrase, the halcyon days. They're the days of calm, the days of peace. And the kingfisher, for Ruskin, is a symbol of balance and of peace and of that center moment in the world in which the light, having gone to darkness, is reignited. So what we see with the kingfisher is the beauty of the plumage of the kingfisher in the picture. But we also know and think and meditate upon a meaning behind the kingfisher. And that's what Ruskin wanted us to make sure that we also knew. That it was part, and he wanted the scientists to know that. Because it's actually the opposite of what we might assume. Ruskin is telling us that our eyes will see more once we acknowledge the many and varied experiences that have gone before than if we assume that our own current point of view is in some way neutral. Our own view is not neutral. Finally, Ruskin allows we can apply our theories, the third of those categories, investigating with mechanics and chemistry and all our other intellectual tools, because now, only now, will we apply them wisely. Ruskin called this fragment of an Alp. He didn't paint the whole Alp, he didn't need to. He painted a rock that has fallen from the Alps. So this rock becomes a sort of totemic thing there that is a fragment of an Alp. And Ruskin used to say that a rock, when examined closely, will be found to be a mountain in miniature. So here, for Ruskin, this rock has in its very fabric Alpness, as opposed to Cronus. Science, Ruskin argues, is a wisdom learnt from looking clearly at the world in order to teach the laws for life, not of life. That's a really important distinction, that science should teach the laws for life, not the laws of life. When we study the really great scientists of more recent times, actually we see that they follow Ruskin's pathway, developing profound intuitions from their brooding and dream-gifted imaginations. From Einstein to Hawking to Lovelock, our most far-seeing scientists have humanity at the center of their concern, even if they can see clearly into all manner of the non-human. They see, as Ruskin saw, the danger that lies in the toolkit of the scientist, which can be deployed without reference to the vision that once helped it to unlock the mysteries of things. In other words, we're talking about technology. And so we need to think about this, because technology is dominated, it began to dominate Ruskin's life and Ruskin's world, and we are in that stream, and that stream has got bigger and more powerful, and it is sweeping us along at a great pace. Ruskin's greatest concern was the marriage of classicism, reappropriated in the Enlightenment, and the technologies developed in the Industrial Revolution for the purposes of mass production. He saw this as already producing dire social conditions in his youth, but he greatly feared for the consequences once Darwinism was applied to laissez-faire capitalism. I want to note that Ruskin was observing the disconnect that occurs once the spiritual and material are divorced. When our underlying consciousness loses its imaginative capacity, language itself becomes corrupted. It becomes a device that imprisons thought, hiding beneath the gaudy mask of a mundane, dry materialism, or language becomes the cunning agenda of manipulation. Ruskin believed that under such influences, language becomes increasingly obsessed with death, darkness, and in the case of art, the colour black. So let's get something a bit brighter, shall we? This is the turret at Brantwood. Ruskin built this on the edge of his little bedroom. His bedroom is so small that it was just barely big enough for him on his own, and a very dark little room. But he chopped the corner off the room and he put this turret on it. It's only big enough for one person at a time, but when you stand in it, you're in infinity, and you look out upon the mountains that he loved and the lake. When we allow language to reflect perception directly and tell what it saw in a plain way, then the perception of feelings, of empathy or fear within a framework of call and response speaks to our common humanity at a level that is free of territorial or cultural barriers. Ruskin's writings, indeed the whole public life in this regard, are gifted with this power to speak directly to our actual, we might even say our raw experience, one that is unmediated by obedience to a controlling intellectual scheme. So, Mahatma Gandhi could apply unto this last to transform the lives of millions in India, while John Muir fashioned his ideas on wilderness, reading modern painters, and Yanagi Suetsu and Shoji Hamada reconnected Japanese to their folkcraft traditions with the reading of the nature of Gothic. All these things, and many, many more that we've heard about in the last 2 days, all happening simultaneously, and Ruskin's language able to reach all of these very different cultural and social and even economic sort of levels of people to inspire them. The central message of Kings of Treasuries is the vital role that books, the written word, indeed libraries, and by extension museums, in their widest definition, play in our civilization. Because all of these things of Ruskin's spread through those mediums. So I just want to think about that medium for a moment. Because Ruskin valued books. He loved books, and he speaks so warmly of them. So what would he feel today about the World Wide Web? Well, for as long as it was a type of super library, the World Wide Web was absolutely wonderful. A remarkable liberation. It allowed us to sit down with just about anyone, anywhere. Surely Ruskin would have loved it. The Beaupre Antiphony, which he placed in Oxford, in his teaching collection there, can be read by millions of people. It's online, anywhere around the world. And the same for hundreds, thousands, indeed millions of treasures. And this is marvellous. But, as Tim Berners-Lee says, sorry, I don't need to do that yet, we'll stay with this. But as Tim Berners-Lee said in his recent BBC David Dimbleby lecture, and Tim Berners-Lee, you'll remember, was the man at CERN who developed the World Wide Web. I'm not talking the internet, I'm talking the web. But Tim Berners-Lee said in his recent lecture that the web is conveyed and now controlled by the internet. And the internet is a different and less benign thing altogether. The internet, you see, is not just a publishing medium. It's a distributed executive power which can use data to enable or deny human agency according to a series of formulae, which we call algorithms. It also has power over machines, turning them on and off remotely. It makes no difference to the internet whether it triggers a coffee machine or an atom bomb. Until recently, at least, it seemed to many, intoxicated by the sheer reach of such digital networks, that we were entering a brave new world, where the enlargement of possibilities through infinite configurations of connection would essentially be good for humanity. But we are in danger of misunderstanding what we are creating, and it's something that we need to look at and see very clearly. We need to see what we are doing in the realm of artificial intelligence, and our relation to the machine is the challenge that we need to rise to today, because it is otherwise going to stop us achieving the balancing of our environment that we so desperately need to do. So let's talk a bit about the environment. There's a real danger, I think, when we talk about the environment, that we will use history as a type of comfort blanket, a palliative to mend our sense of depletion and to spice up our lives. You see, nature is beautiful, and beauty is good for us. But at the same time, we can sort of retreat to nature and try and ignore what's going on in human lives that we need to address. Romanticism was born as a radical response to the despiritualization of nature, but it descended into popular nostalgia for passing ways of life. It teaches us about what we love, but it also does allow us to indulge in escapism. And we have to be honest that art allows us to do this as well. We heard of C.R. Ashby and the Guild of the Crafts Guild. Ashby was indeed set his Crafts Guild up at Toynbee Hall, which is a place we also heard of. And Ashby came here to California, as we heard. A wonderful craftsman, producing exquisite objects. But at the end of his life, Ashby wrote this: "We have made of a great social movement a narrow and tiresome little autocracy, working with great skill for the very rich." And after all that he created and the beauty of what he created, this is a very deeply tragic and challenging thing. We heard how Green and Green, one of the Green brothers, had in a way walked from those palaces that he was creating to his very modest, sort of hand-built, home-built dwelling. So Ruskin has a lot in that, I think, for us to think about. Far from being outmoded, Ruskin's observations are becoming more pertinent every day. They're not in any sense a prescription for denying change, but they do amount to a type of moral compass for us, rooted in truths of human nature. Ruskin wrote a book called The Two Paths, and as Americans, you'll know Robert Frost memorably wrote of two roads that diverged in a yellow wood. My prophecy, forgive me for such an arrogant title, is that we are indeed rapidly approaching the divergence of humanity's options, and that one of these roads is definitely a better road, and it is one which Ruskin can help us to navigate. I believe the power of language to shape I believe in the power of language to shape ends, and Ruskin gives language to vital perceptions. His language and its prescriptions liberate the individual soul in an embrace of shared values, and they have proven themselves to apply universally, and yet always in the particular. So what I want to do in the few minutes remaining to me is to offer a sort of distillation of the essential elements of Ruskin's focus, and then consider how they might play out in the evolving nature of our world. This is obviously a superhuman task, which I shall fail at, but we have at least got that business of failure sort of under our belt, so I feel exonerated. But in a way, it's a slight summary of so much that has been said to date. This is a slightly odd one for me to start with, but it is, I think, quite important. I want to see why Ruskin put so much emphasis on the difference between classicism and the Gothic, because it's so important to his whole critique of society. Jim introduced this right at the beginning, and Emma talked about it in her talk on Venice. So we need to release the idea a little bit from its bonds in a book on Venetian architecture, because it's a principle that Ruskin is actually trying to extract from the experience of looking at Venice for something that can teach the world. Imperfection is in some sort essential to all that we know of life. It is a sign of life in a mortal body, that is to say, of a state of progress and change. Men were not intended to work with the accuracy of tools, to be precise and perfect in all their actions. If you will have that precision out of them, you must unhumanize them. So, what's he saying here? He's looking at the classical stonemason and comparing it to the Gothic. When the classical stonemason sets about his task, the object that he must carve is one of a mathematically, even philosophically defined form. Like children's building bricks, the forms interlock according to a scheme, and the mason must not depart from the mandated language. There is, in this scenario, no room for the individual to express or discover any part of themselves that involves their soul. I chose the White House, I hope you'll forgive me, but of course it is representative of a great deal of buildings all around the world, built on exactly the same model. It might be argued that for the good to its community that, say, the classically harmonious temple brings, the discipline of the world to a rule, of a worker to a rule, is an entirely acceptable price. The temple might have certain fixed elements, but within its geometry, space for variety and expression of individual character can surely be accommodated. It's also true that certain rules of nature, the laws of physics and utility, impose uniform practical considerations that cannot be gainsaid, or the edifice will not stand or be of service. But Ruskin, in his lecture on architecture in Edinburgh, produces this little drawing. It says, "Spray of ash tree and improvement of the same on Greek principles." Now, just in case you think that was limited to the era of the mid-Victorian period, here is a bit of gardening achieved actually at Disneyland Paris. I couldn't resist taking the photograph. I, of course, go to Disneyland Paris frequently. Here we see nature in a particular straitjacket. You see, up to a certain point, all the excuses of classicism hold true. But also the same rules, the same issues, hold true for the Gothic counterpart, where the intricate physics of the building must also be respected. But the Gothic structure allows far greater variety and encourages improvisation within a sympathetic but resilient framework. The great medieval cathedrals, of course, are due testament to that, and we've heard about that in the last couple of days. Ruskin discusses these matters initially in relation to architecture. Did it mean that he disapproved of classical architecture or the ideas of proportion or harmony that underlay it? Well, not entirely. As ever, Ruskin is using it to make a point about something rather different. He dramatically alters our perception of the argument when he applies the same principle to work in a factory. Here, in the tireless machinery of mass production, the classical model of perfection takes on a new meaning. The ideal here means simply identical and endlessly replicable. Perfect and imperfect are success-failure switches. It's obvious that whilst the expression of a certain character through aberrant carving on a classical capital might be tolerable if undesirable, an aberration in the machine will almost certainly lead to disaster and breakdown even before a product is made. Now, in all of this, Ruskin is not, I would argue, being actually utopian. In fact, I think in Ruskin's case, this is all a very perfectly possible dream, not least of all because he's citing history. It's something that's already been achieved. A utopia puts before the public an unrealized, ultimately perhaps impossible dream, an ideal which can easily become a delusion. The illusion of personal choice is one such thing. What Ruskin asks us to accept is that fortune, labour, and human character alike are full of variety, some of it painful, some of it joyful, but that our lives are infinitely richer if we grow up in a society where we all understand this and seek to help one another accordingly. Oh, didn't know I had that one in there. Anyway, here we go. So now, division of the soul and body. This is an English £20 note. Those of you who are English in the audience will maybe have one of these in your wallet. It follows, therefore, that if we are to respect the whole individual in their work, the one thing you are not going to do is to break that person up. Now, this £20 note, you will see, features Adam Smith, and he was one of the few economists that Ruskin actually read. It says at the bottom of the drawing, the division of labour in pin manufacturing and the great increase in the quantity of work that results. This is what Ruskin says in response. We have much studied and much perfected of late the great civilized invention of the division of labour, only we give it a false name. It is not, truly speaking, the labour that is divided, but the men. Now, it's a good and desirable thing, truly, to make many pins in a day, but if we could only see with what crystal sand their points were polished, sand of human soul, much to be magnified before it can be discerned for what it is, we should think that there might be some loss in it also. And it's a rather nice indicator of just how Ruskin's health is improving, that in fact this £20 note that I showed you is being withdrawn from circulation next year, and the new image on the back of it is of J.M.W. Turner. We cannot send a person home at the end of the day of soul-denying work and expect them to put the soul back in. Either they will fail and their spirit will gradually die, or on the reinsertion of such a volatile element, Ruskin says, they will explode and society will be confronted by a revolutionary force. The purpose of technology, of machines and tools, is to make work more fulfilling for the worker and to release their potential to enrich their products or service to the benefit of all and without negative consequences upstream or downstream. Capitalism and mass production instead now empower the designer. And it's the designer who holds the keys within the configurations of labour and the machine. I just want to pause there and think about this. William Morris, actually, was the person who perceived that the shift had gone to the designer. The designer is an absolutely key figure in the future of humanity, because it's the designer who actually lays the groundwork for the way the machine will operate. When the product is designed, it fixes into place all the aspects of the way in which the machines will operate, and therefore all the ways in which the labour force will operate. Design is a complete process, and it locks in all sorts of values and all sorts of consequences. And it's really important that the discipline of design both understands this, and I think it does, but that it actually means that designers are key figures in industry, key figures in business and enterprise, key figures indeed in public life and in government, because it's a process that affects all of us in the most profound way. Moving on. Interdependence of man and nature. We've heard a lot about this, and I'm not going to say a great deal more about it because some very beautiful and very important things have been said in a very positive way. I'm going to add one thing, though, because it goes to the whole issue of the environment, and that is that nature is, and our relationship to nature, is also a matter of social justice. In Ruskin, to feel their souls withering within them, unthanked, to find their whole being sunk into an unrecognized abyss. This nature bade not, this God blesses not. This humanity for no long time is able to endure. In the matter of social justice, Ruskin had observed that when faced with pain and hurt, all living things, humans included, have a tendency to respond to adversity with a type of defensive elaboration and excess, ultimately to the point of violence. He actually first observes that in architecture of all things. But in a late work, Proserpina, about plants, he allegorizes this human experience. And you can probably see at the bottom here of these plants states of adversity. The simple supportive architecture of the leaf in a grass blade, for instance, is thus, when it finds itself the habitué of rocky ground, drawn into an array of spikes, a thistle is born. Ruskin has a whole theory, if you might say, of thistles. A society which lived in a state of adversity with itself or the world around it would express itself in the same way, in everything from its architecture to its military, with similar excess, in order to assert internal repression or external intimidation. Whenever out of balance, think of the balance of the kingfisher, in themselves or with others, individuals would likewise bristle with a proportionate degree of aggression. Ruskin saw that life, whether in contention with human or non-human forces, responded to threats to its well-being with defences that quickly escalated to violence. On the grand scale, he saw this was also true of the climate. And we heard of Ruskin's storm cloud of the 19th century. That turret I showed you was Ruskin's observatory. This is one of the paintings that he made looking out of that, in which he records the state of the sky. He had this picture engraved and used when he published The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, and his arguments about man affecting the climate. Nature mistreated could become our enemy. Nurtured, it will be our friend. Moving on, we have, of course, looked at wealth and ilth, good wealth and bad wealth. Just to let you know, we published a few Ruskin comics along the way, get our message across, since we discovered that adults seemed to be completely unable to put anything that Ruskin said into words. We decided to, and weren't willing to read his, so we decided to make some comics. Anyway, this one, this man wins the lottery, and his life goes to ruin, I'm afraid. And then the spirit of Ruskin, conveniently, when he's in a drunken stupor, comes to visit him and set him on the road to a happier life. Recognizing good riches and bad riches is about recognizing that which pertains to life and that which stifles it. Ruskin talks, for instance, of vital beauty rather than beauty on its own. He looks towards a living force that we recognize beneath the surface, illuminating the material being. This is where aestheticism reveals itself as a product of ilth, actually, not of wealth, because a superficial sensory gratification drains our spiritual capital rather than replenishing it. So, the law of help, composition. Ruskin talked, I'm going to canter through these now because I can see the time is moving along. The law of help, composition. Ruskin links these two things together. This is a painting, I think, Jim, did you show this? You did, didn't you? The one oil painting of Turner's that Ruskin owned. Coincident with Ruskin's observations on classicism applied in the era of mass production was his reading of the application, as I said, of Darwin to laissez-faire capitalism. Ruskin doesn't deny the basic tenets of evolutionary theory, but he was deeply alarmed that the unfeeling logic which accounted for the process of natural selection was coming to be seen as an irresistible and fateful force in human relations. At the heart of the political economist's concept of survival of the fittest is the belief that competition and the fight for survival is the sole engine of positive progress that has delivered mankind to the top of the evolutionary tree. And that its continued application in social affairs is the brutal but ultimately most effective way of ensuring continued development for mankind. So Ruskin, writing in the Alps, where he painted this picture while he was also writing unto this last, his economic treaty, asks, what does this tell us that we didn't already know about the natural world and the propensity of human beings to grow thorns? How does it help us to move beyond inexorable cycles of suffering and disappointment and ultimate personal futility? Enslaved by its own logic, mankind's cultural and intellectual barrenness exercises a type of spirit-denying autocracy that makes our souls prickle. So this is ilth as far as Ruskin is concerned. And he wants to move from ilth, which he sees Turner as, in a sense, embodying both values, to this, to wealth. And this is where that idea of composition comes in. Ruskin says a pure or holy state of anything is that in which all its parts are helpful or consistent. They may or may not be homogeneous. The highest and first law of the universe, and the other name of life, therefore, is help. The other name of death is separation. Government and cooperation are in all things and eternally the laws of life. Anarchy and competition, eternally and in all things, the law of death. Ruskin talks of composition in art as an example of the help of everything in the picture by everything else. It's another metaphor for social justice and an inducement to us to structure all our dealings as acts of composition. One more. Education. Ruskin was a teacher. Actually, we could say education, but we also could say learning, really. Because Ruskin, to turn that around, is ultimately concerned with our ability to learn, with us taking and embodying within ourselves learning. Ruskin believed that education should be experiential, that experience afforded by studying nature in the wild, as we've heard from some of the quotations we've had, and the use of drawing particularly as a means of developing the eye, was foundational. Only by the proximity to the act of making could an individual learn to connect with the consequences of their action. Again, it's another form of empathy. We've had this quotation, so I won't read it out again, about going to nature, but of course it's central. And a picture of some young people at Brantwood enjoying their own attempt to get it, or their own ability to come from schools in an industrial town about 20 miles away and come into the Lake District for the first time for most of those children and actually see something that may help to transform their lives in the future. But all of this actually comes down also to something else, which is faith. And it's faith, fundamentally, not a faith that's specifically theologically defined. In Ruskin, of course, it arises from his own faith in the divinity of things. But actually, it's fundamentally belief in a better world. It's a belief in goodness. Ruskin was optimistic, not idealistic. Ruskin shows realism about human nature, but he seeks to understand it. He understands that death and destruction are an inevitable part of life, but believes that in whatever form they come, they do not negate the power and beauty of life. Indeed, the beauty of life helps us to understand, perhaps not even to understand, but at least to face those hardships of life. And it's an essentially positive view of nature, which he extends to humanity as a whole. And you see the quotation that I put up there: all human creatures in all ages and places of the world who have had warm affections, common sense, and self-command have been and are naturally moral. Human nature, in its fullness, is necessarily moral. Without love, it is inhuman. Without sense, inhuman. Without discipline, inhuman. In the exact proportion in which men are bred capable of these things and are educated to love, to think, and to endure, they become noble, live happily, die calmly, are remembered with perpetual honour by their race and for the perpetual good of it. All wise men know and have known these things, since the form of man was separated from the dust. It is, of course, that is a piece of idealism. It may be even a little utopian, one might say, because it isn't given to all people, even no matter the degree of their saintliness, to necessarily die calmly or even to be remembered. But it embodies a faith about humanity and about goodness. And how can we want goodness if we don't have faith in it? So finally, Ruskin's great phrase, "There is no wealth but life." Here's our lottery winner walking with his dog after Ruskin has spent a bit of time with him. And he goes round the corner, and look there. The sky is lit up for him. One of the things that I think Ruskin does for humanity is that Ruskin speaks to us all individually. He's not developing a social system. He's not developing an ideology. He said there actually should not be Ruskinians, though most of us who do things in the Ruskin world tend to talk of ourselves collectively as Ruskinians. And that's, I think, because everybody discovers their own Ruskin. Or you could, in a funny sort of way, say that Ruskin slightly discovers them. But the truth of the matter is that he has things to say. And some of those things will touch home to people. And it doesn't matter because they're all connected, in a sense, which of those things you happen to connect with. Because connecting with one will connect you inevitably, ultimately, with all of them. But I think that the fact that Ruskin speaks directly to the individual is incredibly important, because we live in an era, and we are going to be living in an era, in which the capacity of politicians and governmental systems to deal with the problems of the world, frankly, is going to be beyond them. It already appears to be. But if it's not beyond them, well and good. Things will get better. But if it is beyond them, or even if it isn't, our ability to cope with our lives and the lives of people around us and to make the difference to the people that we have that come within our orbit, to follow some of those things that Ruskin has talked about, or we have looked at over the last couple of days, seems to me to offer us, as I said, a type of moral compass that is one which humanity would do well to look at. Ruskin said, it doesn't have to be either, how can one put it? One can do this with some humour and have some fun as well. At the end of the storm cloud of the 19th century, which one might have felt was a rather sort of gloomy prediction of Ruskin's about the nature of the world, he says that whether or not we can actually sort out the changing climate, we can alter the climate within ourselves. We can actually make ourselves start with ourselves, and that would not be a bad place to start. This is not to say that we shouldn't do all the big things. Far, far from it. But it is, it seems to me, something that Ruskin peculiarly offers us, is the ability to address these things within ourselves. You know, when we're sitting in our cars in the future, and the car is doing most of the driving, we can ask ourselves, where is the car taking us? But actually, where are we taking the car? Where are we going? We're all of us now looking down these little screens in our pockets. We're going, like Alice in Wonderland, down into another world. And we're saying that that's our world. But it doesn't have to be our world. It's partly our world. But we don't have to do that. And Ruskin tells us and shows us that there are alternatives and other ways. Anyway, that's a sort of bringing together of things, I hope. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.